All right. Not sure if it's actually showing up, so I just want to make sure everything is working here. Oh, okay, great. Thank you for your patience, everyone. All right, great, thanks. Woo, we had some technical difficulties starting off. So, okay, great. Well, thank you for your patience, everybody who's been waiting, and to our panelists as well. So welcome to today's webinar called NATO Facts versus Fiction. If you watch or read mainstream media, you are told that people in Canada believe that NATO is a good and necessary military alliance set up purely for defense. But many people do have questions about this media narrative. That is, you're not supposed to question this media narrative, but many people do have questions. Questions like, what actually is NATO? Why, when, and by whom was it formed? What purpose does it serve today? What are those mainstream media narratives about NATO and how accurate are they? And exactly whom does NATO benefit today? What is Canada's role in NATO? And what do ordinary working people in Canada get out of Canada's membership in NATO? These are among some of the questions that our guest panelists today will be exploring. My name is Kiran Fatima, and I am one of the coordinators for TAPS, which stands for the Toronto Association for Peace and Solidarity. Our goal is to work alongside other peace-loving people in Toronto and around Canada and around the world to help build a better future for all of us. We are hoping you will join us as we work towards a future with fewer weapons and no war, and with more democracy, real human rights for everyone, and genuine social and economic justice. Today's webinar will have 4 panelists who will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes each. After they have spoken, we will have about a 30-minute or so discussion with some Q&A from the audience, the hosts, and other panelists. So before we get started, I just want to catch everybody up to a few key facts about the origin story of NATO. The NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was formed in April 1949, and its founding members were these countries, 12 countries: Belgium, Luxembourg, Canada, Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Portugal, France, Iceland, Italy, the UK, and the US. Now, mainstream media and Wikipedia and most textbooks will insist that NATO is a purely defensive organization. And they say that it was formed to protect Western Europe and the US from Soviet Union by any means necessary, including nuclear weapons. So the Soviet Union did dissolve in 1990 or so, and yet it still continues. NATO continued long after that, over 30 years ago. And since the original 12 countries, NATO has bloated in size to include 30 countries now in total, including Greece, Turkey, West Germany eventually, Spain, East Germany eventually, the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Estonia, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Latvia, Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. And of course, as we know, we are now embroiled in a war, in a conflict in Ukraine over what is possibly also provocation by NATO's expansionism around Russia, around the borders of Russia and into Ukraine. So another thing I wanted to point out before we get started is that for those of us who might not have known before, some of the original founders of NATO were actually former members of Nazi Germany's military, the actual regime of Nazi Germany. They were invited to join NATO because of their anti-communist work and their anti-communist ideological stances. So we have, you can look up people like Adolf Hoisinger, who helped plan the invasions, who was a Nazi in the Nazi German army. He helped plan the invasions of Poland, Denmark, Norway, France, and other countries. He was a colonel, promoted to colonel in 1940, and in 1944 was appointed Adolf Hitler's chief of staff of the army, chief of general staff of the army. After World War II, he was interrogated by Allied forces, but he was not put on trial. Instead, he worked for the Office of United States Chief of Counsel for War Crimes at Nuremberg, and eventually rose to the ranks of NATO's chairman of the NATO Military Committee, which made him the senior military spokesperson for NATO in 1961. And then he also became the NATO's chief of staff. So he was Hitler's chief of staff and later NATO's chief of staff until he retired. And then he died in his home in Cologne in 1982, having never been tried as a Nazi. Another one was Dr. Eberhard Taubert, who worked with Joseph Goebbels, whatever, in the Nazi Ministry of Propaganda, where he was responsible for designing, among other things, the yellow badge for Jewish prisoners in Nazi concentration camps. He went on to work with the NATO's Psychological Warfare Department, and designed a lot of the anti-communist propaganda that continued to create the Cold War propaganda against the Soviet Union and communism in general. And he died in 1976 in Cologne. There are many others, like Hans Speidel, who was Erwin Rommel's chief of staff during the World War II in the Nazi regime, and then went on to become supreme commander of NATO's ground forces in Central Europe from 1957 to 63. Johannes Steinhoff, who was a Nazi Luftwaffe fighter pilot, later went on to work to rebuild the Luftwaffe, or the Air Force, for NATO later in West Germany. And there are several others. The list goes on and on. In fact, I had to stop myself from going through everybody, or I would be here for a long time. So I want to just point this out to show that NATO's beginnings are pretty shady from the very beginning. So what we're going to discuss today is it's not something new, and it shouldn't come as a surprise. And a lot of the media narrative that we hear in NATO countries about NATO is very much colored by NATO and by the funding that NATO governments and NATO countries, and part of the NATO budget, which is over $1 trillion altogether, with all these countries put together, a lot of it goes towards this propaganda. So without going much further into the intro, I want to introduce our speakers for today. First one is Brendan Stone. Brendan Stone is the co-chair of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. This organization was formed to protest the US wars against Afghanistan and Iraq. Subsequent to that time, Brendan has been involved in a solidarity work for Libya and Syria, and he is involved with the Taylor Report radio program, and he co-hosts the Unusual Sources program in Hamilton. So Brendan, please come forward and go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kieran, and thanks everyone for coming today. Many people don't know this, but before there was a Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, the first anti-war activity for myself and some other people was to protest NATO's war on Yugoslavia back in 1999. That was 78 days of bombing, targeting bridges and other critical infrastructure. And it was the first major war in Europe since the Second World War, not Ukraine, like they're telling you now. Now, NATO's actions led to the dissolution of a socialist country in front of my eyes, and it redrew the borders in Europe. The United States and Germany supported separatist forces in Yugoslavia. They intensified the centrifugal forces that tore that country apart. And that was before coming in for the killing blow, tearing off Kosovo as well. And that's what I want to emphasize here. NATO is an aggressive military organization. Now, we have some wonderful people here today, and I'm sure they can tell you more about Afghanistan and Libya, question period, or in their talk. Let me just look at what happened to Libya. There's an article out there called "Look at Liberated Libya and Despair," which is a good title, if nothing else. And that was a country with the highest standard of living in Africa. And now it is a Mad Max wasteland, even after 10 years. The slave markets are back. It generated an enormous refugee crisis. That was NATO. And it was all because Gaddafi wanted to have some independence. So NATO, in effect, is functioning as an arm of US power and as an alternative to the United Nations, something it has no legal standing to do. So where have NATO's actions been? Attacking Yugoslavia in South Europe had nothing to do with defending Europe from a Soviet invasion. And the other cases are even more egregious. Libya is not in the North Atlantic. Iraq is not in the North Atlantic. Afghanistan is not in the North Atlantic. China is not in the North Atlantic. This is military aggression. And now we have a crisis in Ukraine. How did we get here? Well, you can look up Victoria Nuland and the involvement of United States officials in choosing who would take power in Ukraine in 2014 after the Maidan coup. This has all been documented elsewhere. What I want to point out is that the United States-led Western countries turned a blind eye to every problem in Ukraine since then. They did not adhere to any agreements. The real project was to seize power in Ukraine and make it anti-Russian, okay? There was a treaty during the Maidan disturbances in 2014, and this treaty involved European Union countries as guarantors, and as well as the Ukrainian opposition. And it was about the transition of power to restore normal legal politics in Ukraine. And according to this treaty, Yanukovych would step down and elections would be held. End of story, right? But there were no elections in 2014. A coup government backed by the United States simply took power. Where was Canada? Where was the US? Victoria Nuland was handing out cookies and saying, F the EU on tape. So what resulted was a raving, ethnocentric government that undermined the Russian language, threatened to take over Russian facilities in Crimea, removed the special status of the Donbass region, and banned political parties representing Russian speakers. A coup government was turning Ukraine into an anti-Russian country. And when Donbass refused to accept that, Kiev launched a war that up until 2021 had resulted in about 14,000 dead civilians and the creation of 1 million refugees, many of whom Russia had to accommodate. Now, all this time, over the last 8 years, there was another potential solution, the Minsk Accords. And these were to involve a ceasefire and reconciliation between Kiev and Donbass. And Russia was okay with them. It wasn't perfect, but they were okay with it. Poland and France, for the most part, too. But the Poroshenko government in Kiev showed no willingness to implement them. Again, where was the United States? Where was Canada? Nobody put pressure on Kiev to adhere to a peace agreement. And all this time, the Ukrainian army became increasingly armed with NATO weapons, including Canadian weapons, trained by NATO trainers, including Canadians, and integrated into NATO. Ukraine was fast becoming a de facto NATO state. Zelensky later said Ukraine should join NATO, become a nuclear weapons state, and there were signs he was preparing a massive military operation in Donbass. This crossed a red line for Russia because Ukraine could put NATO missiles near Russia, being able to destroy Moscow in 5 minutes and nullify Russia's nuclear deterrent. 5 minutes to Moscow, 5 minutes to midnight. So Russia invoked Article 51, and that's where we're at. For its part, NATO has then egged on and continually refueled the Ukrainian government with ongoing supplies of arms, cash, volunteers, as you know. So it appears as if NATO's end goal is to move right up to the borders of the Russian Federation and dismember it. We have Freeland openly stating that Russia must be defeated. So in Canada, there's always been this skepticism about US adventures. Support for the war in Afghanistan was tepid and diminished over time. Even the NDP could be convinced eventually to oppose NATO's wars in Afghanistan and Yugoslavia. It used to be the default position of Canadian peace organizations that Canada should leave NATO or NATO should not exist. I'm sure Tamara and others could tell you they may remember that. So the NDP even thought they could win on that platform. There are liberals that talked in that manner too. But that kind of thinking is long gone. Now it's like a spell has come over the entire Western world where nobody can criticize NATO. Nobody ever leaves NATO. They think that NATO is responsible for our safety instead of it antagonizing powerful countries and leading us to nuclear war. So I would end by saying that back in 2001, We were holding up signs at Carmen's Banquet Center in Hamilton, protesting Bill Clinton's visit, where he was being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to speak on humanitarianism after bombing Yugoslavia. There weren't as many internet commentators back then, but some observers were telling us that in 20 years, there would be another war in Europe because Russia would be forced to react to all this NATO encroachment and threats to its security posture. We don't have another 20 years to see what the outcome of the present conflict will be. Europe needs a new security arrangement that's based on their actual defensive needs and not the need to carry out US directives. Canada needs an independent foreign policy. You know, the last 2 years with the disastrous consequences of arresting Meng Wanzhou, the catastrophe in Ukraine, and the inflation from wars and sanctions show that we need to exit US hegemony. And the impetus for that will only come from the grassroots. So that's why I would say you need to come out and join the Canada-wide Days of Action from June 24th to 30th, protest NATO's Summit in Madrid. In Hamilton, we're going to rally at 1 p.m. on Saturday, June 25th. The location is to be announced. You can check the website, hcsw.ca, and get on the mailing list. And so that's where I think action needs to go. And I'm sure you're going to hear a lot more. So thanks very much for your time. And I hope to hear your interesting questions.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Thank you very much. Yes, Canada does need an independent foreign policy. I think that we can, many of us are very aware that it seems to be that no political party that's in power in Canada has that on the agenda. Everybody just seems to want to compete on who can be more of a lackey for US foreign policy. I mean, you have right now these, just recently, the Summit of the Americas, the so-called Summit of the Americas happening in LA, and Justin Trudeau was there. The president of Mexico boycotted it because the US failed to invite Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. And so a lot of the other countries boycotted. I'm sure Ben maybe will talk about that. But, Canada was there. Canada did not have the spine to stand up for Cuba, which supposedly Canada has had a long-term, relationship with. So it's very, very embarrassing at best. Okay, well, thank you for speaking up, Brendan. And yes, there is this NATO summit happening in Madrid next week. And we are going to be there. There are events to protest against that all over the world. And yes, the one in Hamilton that Brendan spoke of, there's going to be one in Toronto as well. And I will share some details about that later on during this event. Right now, I want to introduce our next speaker, who is Tamara Lorincz. Tamara is a PhD candidate in global governance at the Balsillo School for International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University. Her research is on the climate and environmental impacts of the military and war. Tamara is a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Canada. Tamara is also on the advisory committee of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, World Beyond War, and No to War, No to NATO network. She has a law degree from Dalhousie University and a master's in international politics and security studies from the University of Bradford in the UK. She is a new senior researcher for the NATO to Neutrality Working Group for Science for Peace. And she is definitely one of my inspirations. And I know she's been protesting NATO for a very, very long time. So welcome, Tamara. Please go ahead and take the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to TAPS for including me in this panel. I'm going to begin by sharing some crucial background information about NATO's expansion over the past 30 years during this post-Cold War period. And I'm going to share some slides with you. I hope everyone can see my slides okay. So in 1992, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Warsaw Pact disbanded, there was no longer a justification for NATO. The Allies no longer needed to spend so much money on their militaries, and they did not need to buy new weapon systems. People around the world in the early 1990s were calling for a peace dividend, a reduction in military spending and an investment in social welfare. And that's the message that Bill Clinton, a Democrat, got when he became president of the US in 1993, but Clinton didn't listen to the people. He listened to the weapons manufacturers. In the mid-1990s, the weapons manufacturers, led by Lockheed Martin, pushed hard for NATO expansion. It was Lockheed Martin's Vice President of Strategic Planning, Bruce Jackson, who formed and led the US Committee to expand NATO in 1996. And at the same time, Jackson established the Project for a New American Century, PNAC, with prominent neoconservative foreign policy figures like Bill Kristol, John Bolton, and Robert Kagan. And as some of you may know, Kagan is the partner of Victoria Nuland, who has worked for the US State Department for the past 30 years. And she's the one that Brendan spoke about, who helped orchestrate the coup in Ukraine in 2014. Now, going back, in 1997, PNAC released a report entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, that called for the United States to maintain military preeminence and global domination, and that US leadership in NATO was crucial to make this happen. And the report also argued that Russia and China must be contained and not threaten American interests. So it was American weapons manufacturers that had a great influence in shaping US foreign policy and expanding NATO. In the 1990s, Jackson traveled with Lockheed Martin's CEO, Norm Augustine, to the Eastern European countries to convince them to join the Transatlantic Alliance because they saw new markets for their weapon systems. And then back in the United States, Jackson and Augustine pushed Congress to support this expansion. And during this period, one of the staunchest supporters for NATO expansion in the Senate was none other than Senator Joe Biden, who's the current president, of course. And in 1998, the Senate voted overwhelmingly to approve Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic as new members of the alliance. But ironically, that same year, the Senate voted to reject the United States from joining the Kyoto Protocol, that first really important climate treaty. Then Jackson and Augustine pressured the US government to give loan guarantees to these new NATO members in Eastern Europe to buy weapon systems. So American taxpayers subsidized the purchase of these weapon systems. Canada didn't even bother to have a parliamentary debate on NATO expansion, though Canada, of course, is one of the founding members of NATO. And then the committee to expand NATO that was led by Jackson of Lockheed Martin evolved into the Project on Transnational Democracies. And in the early 2000s, this Project on Transnational Democracies lobbied the US government to admit even more members into NATO: Bulgaria, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, and others that Kieran identified. And an important aside was at the same time, in 2002, Jackson also established the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq and served as its chairman. And this committee, of course, pushed for the invasion of Iraq and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein because the United States wanted to control Middle Eastern Europe. Now, for Bulgaria and the other Eastern European countries to become a member of the alliance, they have to meet certain conditions. And these are not just military conditions, but also they must adopt political and economic measures. So for instance, they have to move towards, free market economy, they have to modernize their armies, and they must ensure that they're interoperable with the allies, especially the United States, which has always led, and it's always been an American general that has led NATO. And this is why the US weapons manufacturers love NATO, because they see it as a guaranteed market for their weapon systems. And this is also why, so this is the expansion of NATO over the past 30 years. You can see from 1999 on. This is a slide from the NATO Association of Canada. This is why the weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics are funding the NATO Association of Canada, which serves as a propaganda arm for the alliance in the country. And this is why also the weapons manufacturers, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, L3, Boeing, Raytheon, and others were exhibiting their weapons at CANSEC. CANSEC is the big arms show that takes place in Canada's capital in Ottawa every spring, June 1st and June 2nd, and we were there protesting outside the arms fair. There we are with our banners, and again, Lockheed Martin stopped selling war machines. We were calling for CANSEC to be shut down. There were hundreds of us. We were blocking the cars going into the arms fair, and we delayed participants getting to hear our new defense minister, Anita Anand, give her address on the opening day of CANSEC. And in her speech, she said, Canada is raising defense spending by over 70% to 2027, and this will improve our ability to contribute to NATO and NORAD operations. She also has said repeatedly that NATO is a cornerstone of Canada's defense and security. Now, you should know that military spending has increased in almost 70% in the past 5 years. So you can see from NATO's latest defense expenditures report that in 2014, Canadian military spending was $20 billion, and by 2021, it's now at over $30 billion. Now, at this level of military spending, Canada is ranked 13th highest in the world. This is from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and you can see that the other NATO members dominate this ranking. Canada is also ranked 17th highest in the world for arms exports. This is again from another CIPRI report. In March of this year, Canada's Department of Global Affairs released its report on exports of military goods. And last year, Canada exported over $2.7 billion of weapons to non-US countries. Now that's an increase of over $700 million, or a 40% increase from the previous year. And you can see the countries where Canada exports its weapons: Saudi Arabia, Japan, Ukraine. But you should know that Canada does not disclose our weapons exports to the United States because of a defense agreement. So arms exports are increasing, and primarily they're going to other NATO allies. This past Thursday, Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer released a report entitled Canada's Military Expenditure and NATO's 2% Spending Target. The PBO is projecting that military spending in this country will go from $30 billion to $51 billion by 2027. And that will only be 1.59% of GDP. So it's likely to go even higher over the next few years. Now, with all of this military spending, Canada, and because of our membership in NATO, Canada is not doing peacekeeping. There is a common misperception in this country that Canada is a peacekeeping country. If you look at the latest UN peacekeeping statistics, you will see that Canada is ranked very low on peacekeeping. We're currently ranked 69 with only 60 peacekeepers, Canadian soldiers wearing the UN helmet. So NATO is not protecting peace. It's not protecting security. It's very much about protecting the profits of arms dealers and ensuring exports of weapons. NATO has militarized Canadian foreign policy, and it has militarized our role in the world, and Canadians should be very concerned about this. Finally, I want to quickly touch on two final points, and that is last month, Canada announced that NATO has approved for Canada to host NATO's Center of Excellence for Climate and Security. Now, this is a farce. Canada has showed no leadership on climate. In fact, we have failed to meet every single target of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's NATO's fossil fuel-powered militarism that will make it impossible for Canada to decarbonize and meet our Paris Agreement targets by 2030. And it is why Canada is buying new fighter jets to maintain interoperability with the US. And these new F-35s that Canada is planning on buying will lock us into carbon-intensive militarism for the next 5 decades. And then I also want to mention to you that Canada, because of our membership in NATO, is refusing to join the new UN treaty to abolish nuclear weapons, and it is refusing to observe this first meeting of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that's going to be happening from June 21st to 23rd. So Canada is not going to Vienna for the TPNW, but it is going to the NATO Summit in Madrid from June 28th to 30th. So NATO's demand for military spending, diverts money away from climate financing, from helping us with urgent social programs and environmental programs that we need. NATO, a US-led nuclear armed alliance, threatens us all. This is why it is so crucial for us to oppose NATO. We need to call for Canada to withdraw from the alliance and for it to be abolished. So I would like to echo what Brendan said, and I would like to encourage you to get out on the streets with us between June 24th and 30th. And help us be loud and visible. No to NATO. You can find out more information at the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tamara. Yes, definitely. A lot of information that you packed in here. I think it's really important that people understand the impact of the spending that Canada does on defense, especially as Canada and other NATO countries come under pressure to increase our military budgets, where that money is coming from. That money is coming from the taxpayers. That money should be going towards housing in Canada. There's a growing, housing problem. Housing rents are through the roof. There's growing people living in encampments, people who are homeless, people who are who are getting evicted all the time. Our healthcare is being privatized all the time. More and more long-term care, our seniors, as well as childcare. There is no actual real quality childcare. All of this can be funded, but instead our government is prioritizing increasing military funding and cooperating with NATO and the US military hegemony. So it's not just an abstract issue. It's not just, this is literally cutting into money that should be spent by the government on things like healthcare, housing, public transit. That would be great. There are lots of countries in the world, including China, that have so much high-speed rail, and yet Canada does not have anything close to that. Neither does the U.S. So thank you, Tamara. Next, we have our speaker. Our next speaker is Ben Norton. Ben Norton actually just came from another webinar, which I also did watch. So that was great. I think it's all probably on his Twitter. He's a journalist and a writer and a filmmaker. Ben is the founder and editor of Multipolarista, which is an excellent website and YouTube channel. I encourage everybody to check it out. And he is based in Latin America. So Ben, please come on up.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure being here. It's an excellent discussion. I've been learning a lot, and I'm definitely going to recommend this very informative, insightful panel. Today, I want to talk about how NATO is very much not a defensive alliance. And not only is it a military alliance, it is an economic alliance. And what is its goal? NATO exists to serve as an instrument of US imperialism. NATO was created specifically to integrate militarily and economically Western Europe with North America in this transatlantic imperialist axis. Of course, we saw in the First World War and the Second World War, two massively destructive imperialist wars that were waged largely in Europe by these European colonialist powers. The idea of a cross-Atlantic imperialist alliance between North America and Western Europe is pretty novel, historically speaking. But NATO is one of the key instruments that keeps Europe subordinated to US imperialism, that keeps Europe not only militarily dependent on the US military, but also economically subordinated. to the United States. And this could not be any clearer than we now see with the situation with Russia, where large parts of Europe are heavily dependent on Russian energy. And they are now saying they're going to do a boycott of Russian oil and gas, which is going to cause not only a massive problem internally with skyrocketing prices of energy, which means average working people have to pay 3, 4, 5 times as much for their energy, but it also means for their own economies, that is, even for their own capitalist class, this is going to create a serious crisis because these main German companies and French industrialists are going to be completely uncompetitive because they now have significantly higher overhead. And of course, in capitalism, it's always an endless drive to the bottom, trying to minimize all costs, which also means minimizing protections for workers, minimizing wages, and minimizing energy costs. So Europe is economically not only subordinating itself, but sacrificing itself at the altar of US imperialism. And the notion is that NATO is this defensive alliance, but actually for its entire history, NATO has always been an offensive alliance, and its political role has been as the military and also economic arm of US imperialism, and specifically as a blunt instrument used against socialism around the world. We really need to be clear about that. NATO was formed in 1949 at the beginning of the First Cold War. This is when the United States and parts of Western Europe recognized that the Soviet Union is going to be a significant power. It is not going to be subordinated by Western capital. And they go from a policy of containment to rollback. Now, in the United States, the narrative taught in school books and history classes, the narrative that I learned going to school in public schools in the United States, was always that the US policy in the First Cold War was containment. But actually, the National Security Memo, NSC 68, shows that the policy as of the early 1950s was rollback. That is to say, regime change, that is overthrow of socialist governments, with the ultimate goal, of course, of overthrowing the Soviet Union and the other countries in the Eastern Bloc themselves. NATO was formed in 1949 as a coalition of right-wing anti-communist governments. And we need to be very clear about that. I mean, one of the founding members of NATO was the fascist dictatorship of Portugal. So the idea that now we hear constantly that NATO is an alliance that exists to defend democracy is preposterous. One of the founding members was an actual classical fascist dictatorship that has its origins in classical European fascism of the 1930s, the Portuguese fascist dictatorship, which had colonies, by the way, in Africa and carried out brutal wars of extermination. So going back to the very founding of NATO at the beginning of the First Cold War, it was a right-wing anti-communist alliance. And then, of course, almost immediately, we see NATO's role in supporting Nazis and fascists in Operation Gladio. What is somewhat well known increasingly in the United States and to a lesser extent in Canada and Western Europe is Operation Paperclip. It has gotten mainstream attention. A mainstream journalist, Annie Jacobson, wrote a book about it. It got some mainstream media coverage. This is the CIA operation in which the US government recruited many former Nazi scientists and engineers. And I should stress that these are the people who founded NASA, the US space program. These are people who helped run research at the Pentagon and DARPA, which was at first ARPA and then DARPA, which is the Pentagon's kind of main research hub. Many of them were former Nazis, and they were brought over by the CIA. The CIA itself incorporated parts of the Nazi intelligence apparatus, specifically Reinhard Gehlen, who was one of the most important Nazi spies. He oversaw Nazi intelligence operations on the Eastern Front. So during World War II, this was the top Nazi spy overseeing spying intelligence operations against the Soviet Union, making him effectively the most important Nazi spy. Well, he was recruited by the CIA after the end of World War II. He helped run the CIA's operations against the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. So the CIA's operations against communism were literally run by the Nazi spy who oversaw operations against the Soviet Union. Furthermore, Reinhard Gehlen helped to create Germany's capitalist West Germany's intelligence spy agency, the BND, which still exists today as the unified German Republic's intelligence agency. So the German intelligence agency today was founded by the top Nazi spy. And furthermore, I was talking about how Operation Paperclip is somewhat well known, but less well known is Operation Gladio, which was begun by the CIA and then overseen by NATO. So at the beginning of this panel, Kiran mentioned the important history of Adolf Hoisinger. Adolf Hoisinger was one of the most important Nazi generals, and then he became the top general overseeing capitalist West Germany's army. And he also oversaw NATO's military committee. So this is one of the most important foundational leaders in creating NATO as a military apparatus. He was a significant Nazi military officer, and he was part of a larger apparatus. NATO was overseeing an apparatus of sponsoring fascists and former Nazi collaborators across Europe, not just in Western Europe, but even in Central and going into Eastern Europe. And this was called Operation Gladio. It's known as Operation Gladio, but that was actually only the name of the operation in Italy. Now it's known really as Operation Gladio because we have the most information about Italy's network, but these were called stay-behind networks. It was the NATO stay-behind networks. Every country involved, and there were over a dozen in Western Europe and Central Europe, every country involved had a different name of the operation. There were operations in Belgium and France and Austria and Germany and Spain. So even though Spain was not officially a member of NATO, of course, everyone knew that the fascist dictator of Spain, Francisco Franco, was collaborating with NATO, which once again shows its claim to be supporting democracy completely absurd. And we saw that throughout the first Cold War, these NATO-backed fascist groups, these former Nazi collaborators and fascist gangs, also carried out targeted assassinations against the left. So we need to understand that NATO's wars have not only been the external wars on Yugoslavia, destroying the country of Yugoslavia, the last socialist country in Europe, destroying Libya as an existing nation state. Still today in 2022, 11 years after the 2011 NATO war, there is no central unified state in Libya. So NATO did bring Libya open air slave markets, but it did not bring it a central unified state because the policy of US imperialism, of the US-led imperialist world system, says that if we can't overthrow an existing socialist government or a government that has significant state management of the economy and national control, public ownership of natural resources, then the other alternative is simply destroying the state and pillaging its natural resources. So NATO not only has carried out these wars of aggression, but going back to Operation Gladio and the strategy of tension, NATO was involved in carrying out targeted assassinations of leftist leaders in Europe. And we see working closely hand in glove with the CIA, the role of NATO in Italy in particular, in the so-called years of lead, Anni de Piombo, that NATO was involved in supporting fascist gangs that murdered communist leaders. In addition, we know that NATO was involved in supporting these very shady Italian intelligence and CIA linked networks that were involved even in kidnapping the center, Christian Democratic prime minister who wanted to have a peace negotiation with the Soviet Union and wanted to end the Cold War with the Soviet Union. He was assassinated by this group that called itself the Red Brigades, but it's very well documented now that the people involved in this group were very closely linked to Italian intelligence and the stay-behind networks of NATO and Operation Gladio. So we need to understand that not only has NATO played this role externally in overthrowing socialist governments like in Yugoslavia and destroying countries that dare to have independent foreign policy and state control of their natural resources like in Libya, but also we know that NATO has played a role even within NATO member states of preventing socialist forces from emerging. We see this now with a very clear NATO-backed attack on anti-imperialist organizations, accusing them of being Russian disinformation disseminators and independent journalists of supposedly being backed by the Kremlin. I mean, in addition to being completely absurd and false and defamatory, this is part of a NATO-backed campaign at destroying the left within the countries that are part of NATO. And finally, I want to conclude here talking about how NATO, the so-called North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which actually is the North American Treaty Organization, or more realistic, the Nazi Arming and Trading Organization, it is not only expanding further into Europe with Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Finland joining, but also south into Latin America. Colombia is a special partner of NATO. Colombia, which is in South America, very much not in the North Atlantic zone. Colombia has been doing US NATO military exercises in the Caribbean Sea off the coast of Venezuela, a clear threat against Venezuela. Colombia earlier in 2022, this year, Colombia did military exercises with the US and NATO officers talked about the importance of military interoperability with the Colombian military. That is incorporating NATO military equipment, that is US military equipment largely, from US corporations into the Colombian military so they are interoperable. And for the first time in Colombia's history, the Colombian Navy did military exercises with a nuclear submarine. So the US is not only threatening Venezuela and expanding NATO into Latin America, but it's also sending nuclear technology into Latin America, which of course makes the threat of nuclear proliferation even worse. Brazil is in discussions of becoming a special partner of NATO. And if Bolsonaro can have a military coup, you can bet, which is what, by the way, he's thinking of doing, you can bet that that's one of the real possibilities that he would like to do is incorporating Brazil into NATO. And furthermore, simultaneously, NATO is expanding western into the Pacific region. And we see that now South Korea and Japan, once again, countries that are very far from the North Atlantic region, are participating in NATO meetings. This April, NATO held a meeting of foreign ministers in Brussels. And for the first time, not only did the foreign ministers of Sweden and Finland join, but also we saw that the foreign ministers of South Korea and Japan joined. These are countries that are very far from the North Atlantic region. It's very clear what the goal is. The goal is to create a larger imperialist alliance to wage war on China and also Russia. It's part and parcel of the new Cold War. And that is not just a conflict between different countries. That is a class war that is aimed specifically at overthrowing the People's Republic of China because it still has significant state control of the economy, of the largest banks, of all land is state-owned because the commanding heights of the economy are state-owned. The largest infrastructure companies are state-owned. The telecommunications infrastructure, the public transportation infrastructure is all state-owned. And of course, even in Russia, which does not have a socialist economy, it has definitely a capitalist economy, but with significant more state control over its resources than the Western neoliberal economies. The vast majority of the largest companies in Russia are state-owned companies, and they're largely resource-oriented extraction companies that, I mean, Russia is not part of the imperial core. Russia's a semi-peripheral country economically. The vast majority of its GDP comes from the export of raw materials and semi-produced materials, especially hydrocarbons. And the largest companies in general in the Russian economy are state-owned companies like Gazprom and also state-owned banks. So what NATO is waging in this new Cold War is also, as in the first Cold War, very much a class war. Now, it's not the same, of course. The Soviet Union and the Russian Federation have very different economies, but it is still oriented at being an arm of US imperialism and trying to bring in countries around the world in this anti-communist imperialist alliance to wage war on any country that resists imperialism, and ultimately the US empire being the United States government being the leader of the world imperialist system and the global protector of capitalism. Ultimately, NATO is the imperialist army of capitalism. So I think we really need to understand that history of NATO being founded by fascists, and not only former Nazis, but also the Portuguese fascist regime collaborating with the Spanish fascist regime, Operation Gladio, the wars to destroy Yugoslavia and Libya. And then going up to today, NATO continues to play the same role. And the idea that NATO has ever supported democracy or human rights is completely preposterous. The sub-Saharan African refugees who are being trafficked as slaves would spit at someone who claims that NATO is a defensive alliance in support of democracy and human rights. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, the Operation Paperclip and Operation Gladio, as well as I believe there was one called Operation Bloodstone that I found out. There's all these names that the CIA has given to all these various operations that we know of, and of course, I'm sure there's many more that we don't know of. But yeah, there were lots of people who were part of the Nazi Germany, Nazi German apparatus that went on to become hold high-level positions in West German as well as U.S. Intelligence agencies and NASA, as you said. Even NASA was formed originally by, which I did not know until very recently and was surprised. So thank you, Ben, for bringing your perspective on this issue. Our final speaker is Miguel Figueroa. So Miguel is Miguel is the president of the Canadian Peace Congress, the Canada-wide organization with which TAPS is affiliated. He's also a member of the executive of the World Peace Council. Miguel was an activist in the End the Arms Race Coalition in Vancouver back in the early 1980s and has been involved in the struggle for peace and in building anti-imperialist solidarity ever since then. So please welcome Miguel. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Kieran, and greetings to all of the other panelists as well, and everybody who's joining in this discussion today on YouTube. Let me say from the outset that I'm not at 100% physically today, but nevertheless I'm very pleased to be part of this very important discussion that we're having. And one of the good things about being the last to speak is, of course, a lot of the points that I had thought about covering have already been addressed. So this will hopefully allow me to get through this on time. Let me just begin by talking a little bit about the Madrid Summit itself. As Kieran indicated at the outset, this summit is coming up at the end of this month. I think it's the 28th and 29th of June. This summit will be a particularly, well, for lack of a better word, nauseating summit of NATO, because it will be full of backslapping and triumphalism. The leading NATO interests, obviously the United States and the other large NATO countries like Britain and Germany and France and so on, will be in the glow of their recent advances. And what are those advances? Well, they spring primarily, of course, from the current situation in the Ukraine itself, and I'll have a few words to say about that. But it's certainly the case that following the intervention or invasion of Ukraine on February 24th by Russian military forces, the Western powers and the Western class interests have been very quick to seize on this about the necessity for NATO. The fact that NATO would provide an umbrella for its member states and for all of Europe in the face of Russian expansionism and so on. And in fact, it has helped the United States to consolidate its hegemony over NATO. I think Ben referred to this question, and quite correctly so. Certainly consolidating its unity behind U.S. imperialism, leading to the expansion of NATO. Already we know that Finland and Sweden have voted in favor, or at least their governments have. I don't think the Finnish and Swedish people have been asked in a referendum if they agree with it, but their governments have indicated that they want to now join NATO. Switzerland is also considering it, and of course there is a continuing question about the status of Georgia and Ukraine as part of this further expansion, essentially in an eastward direction, up to the very frontiers of the Russian Federation. And of course, it also adds ammunition, if you excuse the pun, for the argument that all member states should increase their military spending to the 2% of GDP mark, which was established, I think, way back in 2006. But a number of countries still haven't reached that, including Canada. As a matter of fact, as recently as 2014, Canada was only, I think, contributing about 1% of GDP towards military spending. There has been a significant increase over the past 7 or 8 years, to the point that it's now 1.4%. And as part of the budget that was presented this past March, it included not only an $8.5 billion increase in the military budget for this fiscal year, which is 2021-22, but also projections for continuing increases, as Tamara referenced, up to 26-27 to $51 billion. That means that if we look at what the expenditures were last year and where they're likely to be in 6 years, in five more years down the road, it will mean an increase of, more than 100% in military spending, which of course has to be paid for by the Canadian people through taxes, through increased debt, and so on. But ultimately, it's a cost on the Canadian economy as a whole, but particularly on working people and on their taxes and so on. But there's one other thing that's very important about this NATO summit, and that is the fact that they will be approving a new document called NATO 2030, which is their new strategic concept. And as Ben quite correctly pointed out, this will continue the process which began several years ago of expanding the reach and not only influence but presence of NATO beyond what traditionally was understood to be the North Atlantic. They had set up various mechanisms like the Mediterranean dialogue and various other instruments to extend NATO's reach. But this new military document, strategic concept rather, will not only extend that, but probably complete it to transform NATO into officially a global instrument, a military weapon in the hands of U.S. imperialism and its closest allies, but in the first instance, U.S. imperialism itself. So Tamara referred to the budget. I just want to point out. Hang on a second. Oh, I'm going to stop there because we've already dealt with it. Let me just turn to the Ukraine war briefly, because this is the basis upon which NATO, the glow that NATO is using to expand its reach and its military influence and so on. Many people have paraphrased this expression over the years, the decades, and maybe even the centuries. But the first person who is credited with the statement that in war the first casualty is truth actually was Aeschylus, who was a ancient Greek dramatist back in the 5th century of BC. He was the first one to coin this expression. And it's certainly the case, I think you could say empirically, ever since, that it is true, that in fact the first casualty of wars is the truth. And it's certainly the case in the current conflict. And we see lots of examples of it. You know, the ghost of Kiev, you know, this is the Ukrainian pilot who apparently shot down a number of Russian jets over the skies of Kiev. Turned out to be a complete hoax, never happened. There was the Snake Island incident where it was drummed up that there were these courageous Ukrainian soldiers who were resisting Russian offenses on Snake Island, which is in the Sea of Azov. And that they died, and that they were murdered by the Russians, and that they were martyrs of Ukraine. Again, turned out to be a complete fabrication. They did surrender. They didn't fight, and they were taken prisoner. And some of them have actually been subsequently released. In fact, but the biggest lie of all, probably so many lies, could go on for a long time about them. But I think that the biggest lie of all, or certainly purposeful misrepresentation or disinformation, has been the argument that Russia's actions constituted an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. And if you go back to the early days after February 24th, and you look at the stories, not only headlines, but stories in the Western media, whether in Europe or North America or elsewhere, and permeated, of course, through their global media channels, you see over and over again the same expression, the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. It's almost as if they all received the same memo from the State Department, that it was important to hammer this point home as part of the imperialist discourse about the events in Ukraine. And anyone who mentions, as Brendan did a very good job outlining this, the fact that history didn't start on February 24th, and at the very least we need to go back in terms of the internal situation in Ukraine to the Euromaidan coup in 2014, and the fact that it wasn't just the United States State Department and intelligence agencies who welcomed it and provided a cover for the extreme right-wing nationalist government, which included a whole number of Nazis and neo-fascists in its ranks. But in fact, they were involved before the coup took place for many months, if not longer periods of time, in terms of their financing of NGOs, visits of John McCain and others, and so on. It was quite clear that this coup had the blessing of Washington. To talk about the subsequent integration of the Azov Battalion and other neo-Nazi organizations into the Ukrainian military, particularly the National Guard. Any discussion about the repression of the Russian minority, let's remember that back in 2014, almost 33% of the Ukrainian population were Russian-speaking. And the reason for that is maybe not clear to everybody. But, you know, for decades, when Ukraine and other now independent states, the stands in Central Asia, the Baltic states, and so on, they were all part of one country, the Soviet Union. And there were movements of populations between different parts of the country for work, climate, a number of different considerations. So you have a situation where in a number of these countries there are significant Russian minority populations. But after 14, when the coup regime took power in Kiev, they did a number of things. They basically outlawed the Russian language, or they at least removed its status as an official language in Ukraine. And that meant that there couldn't be schools for Russian language schools, services in the Russian language for a very significant minority, 1/3 of the population, and so on. And there was repression of left and democratic forces, including the banning of the Communist Party of Ukraine, the shutting down of television stations and newspapers that were at all critical of the course of the, well, both the history of the coup itself, which was well documented in Oliver Stone's film, by the way. If you haven't seen Ukraine on Fire by Oliver Stone, you should definitely see that film, which documents the whole history of that coup and imperialist involvement in the coup, but also, of course, what happened afterwards with the massacre in Odessa, where hundreds of trade unionists were trapped in the trade union building in Odessa and firebombed, and when they left the building, they were shot and killed. It was a real massacre by fascist forces. All of these things, of course, led to the decision to set up the People's Republics, and for Crimea, in its own right, to secede from Ukraine and to apply to rejoin the Russian Federation. Any discussion about the Minsk agreements 1 and 2, which called upon the Kiev government to negotiate autonomy for the Russian-speaking areas in the Donbass, and to guarantee their language rights and their social rights and so on, which Kiev ignored and refused to do anything about. Any discussion about the growing involvement of US, Canadian, and other NATO forces in not only the arming of the Ukrainian army and its rearming, but also in the training of Ukrainian forces. Canada, for instance, has been involved for a number of years. Over 200 instructors have been teaching the Ukrainian army, and particularly the National Guard, which has been led by neo-fascists. Any discussion about that constitutes pro-Putin or pro-Russian propaganda. Similarly, any discussion about the eastward expansion of NATO, which, as others have referred to, has a long history, going back to 1990, when James Baker, who was then Secretary of State, promised Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch beyond the East German border. Once East Germany was and West Germany were reunited into a single German state, the fact that they violated that agreement over and over and over again, which Tamara documented rather well. Any discussion of these things, of course, is not only suppressed, but is almost criminalized to the point that journalists, independent journalists like Eva Bartlett and others, are being openly targeted in mainstream media as bots for Putin, why various news outlets like the Gray Zone, for instance, are being attacked, and attempts are being made to deplatform a number of these alternative news sites and so on. We may suffer that as well in due course, especially if they watch this discussion. So I'm not going to say anything more about it, just to say that whenever one raises examples of violations of international law committed by U.S. imperialism, and there have been a slew of them. Some of them, of course, have been discussed here, like, for instance, the NATO attack on Yugoslavia in 1999, which wasn't authorized by the UN Security Council. The invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, which again did not have a sanction from the Security Council. The war in Iraq, and so on. To mention any of these things, one gets accused of being of whataboutism. So, oh, don't raise these other things because they're extraneous and they don't relate. Just deal with this specific issue. Well, this too is part of the ideological assault trying to silence any kind of serious analysis. And all you need to do is take an example of Grenada in 1983. In October of '83, when U.S. Marines were sent into the little tiny island in the Caribbean of Grenada, 8,000 troops were sent there, Marines and Rangers and so on. And one of the arguments was that it was necessary because Grenada had more weapons than they needed to defend themselves. Well, obviously, they didn't have sufficient weapons to defend themselves because the Marine action took less than 3 days before they had complete control of the island and its capital, St. George's. But here was an example where Grenada constituted no threat at all to the United States. And yet the United States took it upon itself to violate the UN Charter and the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Grenada. So unlike the situation in Ukraine, which is right on the frontier of the Russian Federation, here was a case where there was absolutely no justification at all. And in fact, it was condemned by the UN General Assembly by a vote of 108 to 9. But that's where it ended. There were no sanctions. There were no military buildup against U.S. imperialism in response to their flagrant violations over and over again in Libya, in Syria, in Yugoslavia, and elsewhere of the UN Charter. I want to I know I'm running late here. I wanted to say something about the history of NATO, and I'm very pleased that Ben outlined much of that history. In fact, even before the formation of NATO, senior interests in the Pentagon, in the State Department, in the White House, and in other capitals, particularly in London, there were private discussions about the fact that as soon as the Second World War was over, that the guns should be turned on the Soviet Union. And this was long before the Soviets had nuclear weapons, and the United States had a monopoly of nuclear weapons. Churchill was very open about it. General Patton, when he was still in Germany, just after the May 9th victory there and the defeat of the Nazi Third Reich regime, said that we should not decommission our military. We should now move on to Moscow. And in the years following the Second World War, even before the formation of NATO, there were secret plans, which are now public, but there were secret plans at the time to, in fact, launch a preemptive nuclear and conventional, both, strike on the Soviet Union. And it was called Operation Dropshot. In fact, they had 19 different plans that they had developed, the most prominent of which was Operation Dropshot. And so this was long before NATO was formed. That senior interests within the U.S. ruling circles were already coming to the conclusion that it was necessary to launch a first strike, a nuclear first strike on the former Soviet Union. And of course, after the Soviets tested a nuclear weapon in 1949, they had to do a rethink because now, of course, there could be consequences for such aggression. And that's when the concept of mutual assured destruction was introduced, the MAD concept. But it wasn't embraced by all of the ruling circles in Washington. There were those who were realists, even people like Henry Kissinger, if you can believe it, and George Kennan, who said, well, you know, the game has changed. We have to be careful. We have to be prudent about this because the Soviets have a nuclear arsenal as well. But there were others who were called the maximalists, who said that a nuclear war was winnable. And the basis of it was, well, if we strike hard, if we strike from close distance, that is to say that the targets that we want to take out, including Moscow, including Beijing, are within 6 to 8 or 10 minutes flight time for our missiles. And if our missiles are accurate, so that they can kind of pinpoint where these missiles are going to land. And finally, if we can set up an anti-ballistic missile system to knock out whatever few missiles that Russia or China would send back, then we can win a nuclear war. And this mentality is still present, and I would argue is the dominant position of Washington, or U.S. imperialism, and by extension NATO itself. So I'm way
Hi, Miguel.
over time
Sorry.
here, so yeah, I'm gonna end right now.
Yeah.
I just want to say that it's for all of these reasons, despite the difficulties, we need desperately to improve and to broaden and to extend this critique of NATO and expose its true class and imperialist character. It's difficult in this current environment, but we have no choice but to do it. That's why these demonstrations that Brendan referred to coming up in the latter part of this month, from the 24th to the 30th, are important. And plans to build a new No to NATO coalition need to be supported. We have to hammer away at this question. We may not win this argument in the short run, but we have no alternative. And so that's certainly where the Peace Congress stands. Thanks.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's really important for us to understand the context. History did not begin on February 24th. There is a long history of NATO's aggression and provocation, especially towards Russia, but also towards China, and especially now with what's going on. We definitely should not follow the narrative that this was just an unprovoked, quote unquote, unprovoked aggression on Russia's part, even if we don't agree with, the actions and stuff. So I know that we're running a little bit behind, but I appreciate everybody's patience. We have a couple of questions that came in. So if you're watching this live and you have any questions for the panelists, you can put them in the YouTube chat, and we will try to address them if we can. So we have a couple of questions already. First one, I'm going to pass it all over to Tamara. And the question had something to do with basically Canada's defense spending or military spending. I know you went over some of those figures already, Tamara, but maybe you could just summarize a little bit if you could contextualize Canada's defense spending compared to the overall budget by the Canadian federal government. That would be great. Thanks.
Well, let me begin by saying a little bit about NATO's military spending. So about 2 or 3 times a year, NATO releases a defense expenditures report, and it's available on the NATO website. You can see the PDF report. And in the latest NATO defense expenditures report, it shows military spending for its 30 member countries. It shows it in US dollars and in the country's own currency. And if you look at the latest report, you'll see that the 30 NATO members spent a combined $1.1 trillion. And of course, the United States dominates that, spending about $800 billion of that spending. But NATO's military spending combined represents about 50% of global military spending. And it's important to consider it in context to Russia and China's military spending. So combined NATO military spending of $1.1 trillion. Russia's is only about $60 billion, and China is about $250 billion. So, less than a quarter of what NATO is spending. So in that report, you can see, of course, Canada's military spending over time. And Canada submitted to NATO military spending for last year of over $30 billion. And that's for the Department of National Defense, Veterans Affairs, and for some of our paramilitary forces, for instance, spending for the RCMP. So, Canada spends a lot on the military. We spend 15 times more on the military than we do spending on climate action, more than we spend on diplomacy. And as you have heard from Miguel, in Canada's latest federal budget, we're going to be increasing it. And of course, the latest address from our defense minister, Canada is going to be increasing military spending by 70% over the next 5 years. But it's really important to remember that we're going to be increasing military spending at a time where we're facing, a climate emergency and a poverty crisis, and we really need to be diverting those resources into urgent social and environmental programs.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Yes. Canada is increasing the military budget, even though, as you say, there's inflation, gas prices are through the roof. These are things that are connected, and people really need to make those connections. So we have another question, and this one was raised for Ben Norton, if you're here. Let me see. The question reads, what would you say about a competing argument that what is happening in Ukraine can be characterized as an inter-imperialist one between the dominant Western core and the regional Russian one? So Ben, if you could talk about this, that would be great.
I find this argument very strange. What regional Russian one? What empire is Russia leading? I mean, Russia is a capitalist power, but not all capitalist powers are empires. And we have to understand that imperialism is a world system, and Russia within that imperialist world system is not part of the imperial system. It is semi-peripheral. And that is reflected clearly in the fact that Russia is one of the members of the BRICS, with Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That's clearly a recognition that Russia's economy is at the same level as Brazil or India, a semi-peripheral economy. The Russian economy, as has often been pointed out since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is really the size of Italy's. And the idea that Italy is, this major economic power that is imposing capitalism and neoliberalism on other countries. No, I mean, that's simply not the case. As I was saying earlier, the vast majority of Russia's GDP, or not the vast majority, the bulk of the Russian GDP comes from the export of raw materials. And where are those raw materials going? Well, until recently, many of them were going, in fact, to the imperial core, with the European Union and even the United States being major importers of Russian energy and Russian minerals. Now, of course, Russia's being forced to find other sources of trade. Now, we also have to have a scientific understanding of what it means to be imperialism. Going back to Lenin and imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. What Russian finance capital is being exported? What Russian capital is being exported? Very little. In fact, even according to World Bank statistics, Brazil and India export more capital than Russia. Russia does have a significant military industrial complex. It does have a significant arms industry, and it does export military technology to countries, including many countries in the global south, but for very different reasons. I mean, Russia has really helped the Venezuelan military. Russia has really helped the Syrian military prevent state collapse. This war in Ukraine, yes, I mean, we can criticize elements of the Russian government and some of its decision-making, But this is not a war between a plucky, Ukrainian so-called democracy and Russia. This is a Western proxy war led by the United States, the leading imperialist power, against Russia. And Russia as a nation, as the Russian Federation, as a state, its security is not even guaranteed. The clear goal of the United States, stated very clearly, is overthrowing the Russian government. Joe Biden said it in a speech in Poland. He said it was a mistake, but that's clearly the US goal. And if you go back to the 1990s, we can see what the US did. And, imperialism, the imperialist world system led by the United States, it imposed this kind of neo-colonial structure on Russia, run by Boris Yeltsin, an alcoholic US puppet who privatized everything for pennies on the dollar. The life expectancy in Russia decreased by several years. The idea that Russia is some great imperialist power, it betrays a complete misunderstanding of basic Russian political economy. And the reality is that going back to 1997, the US imperial strategist, former national security advisor Brzezinski, published in his book, The Grand Chessboard, he said very clearly that the US-led imperialist system should break up the Russian Federation into 3 different states. And he called for creating a European Russia, a Siberian state, and an East Asian state. So we're talking about balkanization of the country. It's a very real possibility that 10 or 20 years from now, the Russian Federation might not exist as a country. No one in their right mind is claiming that Russia is an existential threat to the United States as the territorial integrity of the United States. The attempt to portray these two powers as somehow equal but opposite imperialist powers, it simply demonstrates a complete misunderstanding of imperialism. And people really need to read world systems theory and understand that the Russian economy is at the level of the Brazilian and Indian economy, nowhere near the level of the imperialist powers.
Thank you, Ben. That was very comprehensive. And I think that, I want to share a couple of images that kind of illustrate what Ben was talking about. The United States has at least 800 or so military bases around the world, foreign military bases. I believe Russia has 5, maybe more, but it's definitely not anywhere near that number. China, I think, has 2 foreign military bases. So the United States, just by itself, these are some of them. This is from 2005. It's actually expanded since then. These are just some of the NATO bases that are around Russia, that encircle Russia and China, for that matter. This is happening. This means there are weapons and military bases around Russia, around Russia's eastern border, all over the place. And this has only expanded, even though these NATO was supposedly started only against Soviet Union, which itself, for anybody to think that NATO and Russia or US and Russia are on par, does not know the facts of what's actually going on. And just to illustrate, like if the Russia or China, for that matter, or any country that the United States has historically been at war with or has some kind of rivalry with, if they had bases in Canada or around the U.S., around the U.S.'s borders, this is what it would look like. This is what's going on around Russia and China right now, is that they are surrounded by U.S. and NATO military bases. There's Canadian ships in the South China Sea. Recently, a Canadian Canadian Air Force was shooed away by the Chinese military, the Chinese Air Force, in the airspace above DPRK, North Korea-China border. And it was reported in Canadian media as the Chinese PLA Air Force was harassing the Canadian Air Force, as though the Canadian Air Force just has the right to be there and at China's border. And if China says no, go away, that's up to China to be harassing Canada. It doesn't make sense. The United States, and by extension Canada, believe that the world is their oyster and they just have the right to go anywhere and do anything they want. And maybe they don't. And, this is part of the hegemony that we have been discussing. So does anybody else want to address any of that, or can we move on to another question? I believe maybe our final question for the evening or for the afternoon. Let's talk about what are some, and this, everybody has touched on it a little bit, but can we just wrap up with some sort of messaging about what can somebody who is concerned about these issues, who is anti-war, who wants a better world, what can be done? I mean, NATO seems like such a big entity, trillions of dollars, millions of people who are in the personnel. I mean, entire countries' budgets are increasing to support this. What can we do? What can the average person in Canada or for that matter, anywhere else in NATO countries do? Any suggestions and ideas, and we can wrap it up after that. So let's start with Brendan. Brendan, go ahead if you want to speak.
Well, I don't want to be too repetitive. Just as others have mentioned, there are the events later this month where there is going to be information about that. There's also going to be other panels held about learning about the issues between Russia and Ukraine. Things are being planned for July potentially, so you want to check hcsw.ca. But ultimately, people do have to educate themselves. They should be looking at the Canada Files and Moon of Alabama and Ben Norton and Multipolarista and various other publications, so they can talk with their friends. There is concern in Canada about where we're heading, just as in Europe, many countries are concerned about the ride that the United States is taking them on. They're realizing there's no end, no limit to this crazy ride with Ukraine. So people need to be aware that they're not alone, and then they can be invited to rallies. They can be invited to panels, sources of alternate media. People need to start linking hands, essentially.
Thank you very much, Ben. I have a kitten here who is keeping us company. Thank you. Brendan, thank you. Yes, please do check out the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. They're doing amazing work. They are holding panels as well, and as well as in-person demos and rallies and educational forums, which I think are, we try to work with in TAPS and the Canadian Peace Congress, and they're an excellent group. Let's go to Tamara. I know, Tamara, you mentioned you were part of the recent demo against CANSEC, which is the Canadian arms industry trade exhibition that happens in Canada. And I think that I saw the photos coming out of there. I know some of the people who were there were harassed by the cops and stuff. So if you can share any of your guides, inspiration in terms of what you recommend for people, how we can fight back.
Well, I would like to close by reminding people that most of the world is not in NATO. Of the 193 countries that are part of the United Nations system, there's only 30 that are part of NATO, and NATO has only existed for 73 years. It can be dismantled. It's not something that's permanent. And with enough public pressure, with enough people power, we can dismantle it. And it's really important for us to work together, to work with our American and European allies to work for the abolition of NATO, and it's possible. And there are alternatives. There's the concept of neutrality. Ireland is a neutral country, not part of NATO. And there's also this idea of common security. And I want to bring to people's attention the International Peace Bureau, the ITUC, and the Olof Palme International Center released a really excellent report last month on common security, our shared future, saying that security is indivisible. The security of one country can't be at the expense of another country. And so NATO is undermining all of our security. And I want to warn everybody that NATO's continued existence is going to make it impossible for us to achieve the Paris Agreement by 2030 and the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. That it is why it is so essential for us. It's an imperative for us to work for the dismantling of NATO, and we can do it if we're in solidarity. So I'll put a link to that. I encourage you again to come out on the street during the NATO summit in Madrid at the end of this month, for you to be on the streets where you are to say no to NATO.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Thank you so much for all that you do. Next, I will ask Ben to wrap up with any closing thoughts, anything you want to talk about, as well as, your experience living in Latin America, as somebody who was originally from the US but lives in Latin America, what are some things that people, maybe who are in global South countries that are obviously not where you are, might not be directly affected by NATO, but what are some ways that we can show solidarity, those of us who live in Canada and imperial cold countries, with people who are in places like where you are?
Well, as I said, NATO is actually expanding south into Latin America, very far from the North Atlantic region. Colombia is a special non-NATO partner that does military exercises with NATO. Trump declared Brazil to be a special non-NATO partner, and we're seeing more military collaboration. So the threat of NATO expansion into Latin America is very real. It's already happening. And of course, that threat is aimed at Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, the socialist and progressive forces in the region. The final thoughts that I have are, I think it is completely imperative to stress to other socialists, to leftists, to progressives, that NATO has always been a right-wing anti-communist instrument of US imperialism, and it has never been a progressive force. It has never been a pro-democracy force. It has always supported the most reactionary interests, the most far-right fascistic elements, not only outside of NATO member states, but within NATO member states. And the idea that NATO can become a force for social democracy or human rights is preposterous. It betrays a misunderstanding of the entire history of NATO. And I think it also really shows that this concept of social chauvinism is still very much alive in parts of the global North left. And this goes back to World War I, when the Second International split in 1916 over this fundamental contradiction of imperialism. And we see today parts of the left, especially social democratic forces in the global North, who are unifying behind NATO. To me, it's so similar to the social democratic forces that supported their imperialist governments in World War I. And this is our historical echo 100 years later of those same social chauvinists. And even more strangely, we've even seen some people who claim to be communists and Marxist-Leninists who have also pushed this very strange, distorted analysis that I think completely misunderstands Lenin's analysis of imperialism, to try to argue that this is just an inter-imperialist rivalry, and in some ways even portray Russia as the aggressor, ignoring the history of NATO expansion and circling of Russia, the US and NATO and the European Union refusing to abide by any of the provisions that were mandated by the Minsk II agreements, of them refusing to give Russia written security guarantees in violation of international law, and also completely misunderstanding Russia's role in the imperialist world system as a semi-peripheral country, and basically ignoring what Lenin had said about turning the imperialist war into a civil war. There's a lot of people who are turning the imperialist war into an extra imperialist war, accelerating the imperialist war, and they think that Russia is the imperialist power and that NATO is somehow defending democracy or something, which is actually siding with the imperialists. And instead of turning the imperialist war into a civil war, it's accelerating the imperialist war. So there's been a very strange attempt to rewrite Lenin and rewrite imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And I think it's really tragic. So it's important not only to talk about that history, but I think it's also important to engage with some of these foundational texts. And there are even some communist parties, the unfortunate statements from the KKE in Greece, the Communist Party of Greece. Those statements have been criticized by the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. I think it's good to study those statements. And not only, obviously, I think the majority of our time should be spent, having these debates and educating people who are kind of progressives and liberals and on the fence and could be convinced. But also, I think we need to have these debates with people who call themselves communists and Marxist-Leninists, and I think who have a very tragic misunderstanding of imperialism. And to be fair to the Communist Party of Greece, you can't accuse them of being soft on NATO, but those arguments in some ways are being used by NATO to advance the interests of imperialism. So we need to have a more sophisticated analysis, I think, and engage in a lot of these debates. And one of the ways we start doing that is by having panels like this excellent discussion today. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much. I appreciate
Sharon,
that.
Can I have a quick word too?
Yes, I was going to turn to you next.
Okay,
If you can address the same question, Miguel, what can everyday
Yeah.
people do in imperialist countries to
Well-
push back against NATO?
Right. Well, I think that, Ben makes a very important point. It is necessary to engage with what has sometimes been referred to as the pro-imperialist left, or so-called left, which is kind of like a left bower of imperialism in these kinds of debates. But the larger question is that the working class and the working people more broadly need to be made conscious of the tremendous dangers that exist here. And one of those dangers is the threat of nuclear war. I mean, we are on a short path to a nuclear war, which will be devastating for humanity as a whole, and probably most other forms of life as well. And our membership in Canada, because by and large we're operating in Canada, is to deal with Canadian foreign policy, to get Canada out of NATO, to get Canada out of NORAD, and to point out to working people that regardless of the issue, whether it is getting Canada to sign on to the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, or to cut the military budget and redirect those funds towards, addressing climate change, towards the housing crisis in this country, to raising the real wages of working people and of pensioners in this country. All of these kinds of things are intimately connected with the issue of NATO, because every time you raise these questions, they say, well, we're obligated because we're a member of NATO. We can't sign the treaty. We can't cut military spending and so on. So we need to use the arguments about the social costs, the existential costs of NATO. We should call for the dissolution of NATO, but not just the dissolution of NATO in a vague sense. We need to get a movement of Canadians to get out of NATO now. And the more there are movements to disaffiliate from NATO, the more likelihood that will lead to the dissolution of the alliance as a whole. So this is the big challenge, and there's no shortcuts here. We need to get involved in our unions. We need to raise the issue of military spending and the misallocation of resources away from the social needs of the people. We need to hammer away at the danger of nuclear winter and the costs of nuclear war. It surprises me, frankly, that nobody is discussing the danger of nuclear war in all of this. This is a major issue, and why isn't it on the agenda the way it was in the early 80s? I think there's been a conscious effort to silence that debate and to attack the concept of nuclear winter itself by the powers that be, because they know that if they don't do that, more and more people are going to say, wait a minute, where the hell are we going with all of this? And that's what we need to try to inject into this debate and put this issue on the table.
Thanks, Miguel. That's great. I think that one of the issues is that there's a lot of argumentation for the sake of argumentation that happens in the so-called Western left, where we really need to be materially, physically, politically, and in every way that's actually relevant, doing what we can from the inside to educate ourselves and those we know, our friends, family members, our coworkers, our unions, if we are lucky enough to be in a workplace that's unionized. And yes, we do need to be actively involved in our local peace movements, wherever we are. If you're in Toronto, you can check out torontopeace.com. You can send us a message from there. We'll add you to our email list because we are going to be holding other events. We are, for example, our next event is going to be on June 24th, similar to the events that Brendan talked about in Hamilton. This one is also going to be against the, it's going to be a rally held in Toronto against the NATO Summit, which is happening the following week from the 28th to the 30th. So I'm just going to quickly share info about that. We don't have a location yet, but these are, it's just we just have a time. And if you follow us on torontopeace.com, you can follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and it's going to be once we have details, we'll share those there. But we are going to be also we are planning a rally against the NATO Summit that's happening at the end of June. So get involved if these are issues that obviously are important, which they are. Then get involved in your local peace movement and, do what you can. And yes, as Brendan said, and as everybody else has said, educating yourself is very important because part of what's going on here is an information war. And what the imperialists are relying on is that we don't educate ourselves, that we continue to listen only to the mainstream media that tends to work in collusion with the imperialist powers and intelligence agencies, as was recently revealed about another big liberal outlet, Bellingcat, which a lot of mainstream media get their news from. They quote Bellingcat, but, if you haven't already heard, there was a big expose about about Paul Mason in the UK. So I'm sure many of the people in the audience already know, but there's, a lot of these so-called liberal outlets are actually funded by or backed by weapons companies, military industrial complex, government, State Department, NED, and in the case of Bellingcat, possibly even, connected with intelligence agencies. So there are, all kinds of issues that we could be having because we are not getting our information from any kind of source that actually cares about the people, about the working people in Canada, in the UK, in the US, in Europe, or anywhere else in the global South, never mind. Our governments do not care about them. Are the military corporations that all they care about is making profits, making more war, selling more weapons. The $40 billion that the United States is sending to Ukraine recently, again, which I think makes the total now over 60 billion. That's actually just a kind of money laundering that's going from taxpayer money into the pockets of these large weapons companies like Raytheon and other ones like Tamara mentioned as well. So we need to fight back. We need to educate ourselves, and we need to tell people who we know and get involved in a real way and integrate anti-war and anti-imperialism into our everyday life. So I want to thank all of our speakers today. I want to thank Brendan Stone from the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. I want to thank Tamara Lorincz from all the amazing organizations that she's part of, including the Voice of Women, Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. And I want to thank Ben Norton from Multipolarista, who's a journalist based in Latin America. And I want to thank Miguel Figueroa from the Canadian Peace Congress. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to everybody who sent in questions. And thank you to our team of moderators as well. We wish you well. Please follow us on torontopeace.com, and we will see you in the streets. And we will see you building a better world for tomorrow.